but I think it's worth saying again. Our muscles need rest days from the gym in order to grow back stronger. Yes, definitely true. Is the brain designed to be consistently learning and developing, or does it need periods of rest from consuming new information? Or is the rest when we sleep? Great questions. Thank you, Timothy. Yes, indeed, our muscles get stronger, grow after a proper stimulus is applied to them in the time after we provide that stimulus, which typically is resistance. But since not everyone's interested in that, it's also the case that an endurance adaptation occurs after we embark on the run, the hike, the swim, etc. There's something kind of interesting, and I just want to take a moment and just mention that there's something kind of interesting about resistance training, is that it's the one form of training that, because of the enhanced blood flow to the muscles while we do it, gives us a window into what the adaptation might look like once it occurs if we allow proper rest. Whereas with endurance training, it's very different, right? You go further or you run up a hill until your legs burn and you want to vomit up a lung, and then the next time you do it, you don't feel quite as bad, right? The adaptation occurs, of course, in a very similar way to resistance training, different mechanisms, but there's a delay in adaptation and you get better. It's just that with resistance training, you can kind of sense the change before the change occurs because of the enhanced blood flow of the muscles. With endurance training, you sense the limit of your ability and then you exceed that limit subsequently. Now, in terms of cognitive learning, the same thing is basically true. If you want to get really technical about it, the computational biology, the modeling of this says that if you want to learn something, probably setting the difficulty of what you're trying to learn to about 85% correct trials, 15% error trials is probably ideal. What does that mean? It means if you're trying to learn a new piano piece, or you're trying to teach that to a child, if they're not starting from scratch, let them play something that they know pretty well and then introduce a small percentage, maybe 10 to 15, maybe 20%, you don't have to be exact about this, of novel material that's hard for them to learn. But yes, it is the focused, deliberate attempt to learn something that creates that sense of underlying agitation that is the trigger, the stimulus for neuroplasticity. This makes sense. If you could complete something, if you could do something, a scale of music, a physical task, speaking a new language, if you could do that, why would your nervous system ever change? And how does your nervous system know if it's supposed to change? Right? Your nervous system doesn't know successful trial versus failure trial. Right? I've tried many times to learn other languages, and I'm modestly terrible at Spanish, but if I were to try and get better, my nervous system doesn't know when I'm failing. It has no idea. What it knows is the release of certain neuromodulators, namely adrenaline and norepinephrine, and a few others as well, that are associated with the underlying agitation of like, oh, I'm failing at this. I'm not able to remember that Spanish class because I didn't attend in high school, and this is really difficult. And that agitation, the frustration, is the stimulus. But when we say frustration, it's the neurochemicals that when they bathe the surrounding neurons, those neurons go, oh, something needs to change for next time. And lo and behold, the stimulus for neuroplasticity has occurred. But the actual rewiring of the neurons, either the improvement or the reduction in the strength of synapses, of connections between neurons, and in rare instances, the addition of new neurons for neuroplasticity occurs, yes, when we sleep, in states of deep rest or non-sleep deep rest, although there's less data to support that, but the actual rewiring occurs away from the stimulus. So there's really two important principles here. One is that agitation and stress and the neurochemicals that underlie agitation and stress, that is the stimulus for learning. And goodness, do I wish they had taught me that in school. I mean, they taught me all sorts of things in school, but they didn't teach me that. They didn't teach me the physiological side. Lord knows I would have done better in life if I had a couple of those tools. Instead, they told me, look, if you drive drunk, you could die. That was good information. But they didn't tell us about all the other stuff. So I wish they told us about this stimulus and rest thing, and somehow they have permission to talk about the rest. All right, what's my take on hallucinogens? Goodness gracious. My take on hallucinogens is, I've taken them, clearly. Well, here's the real story on hallucinogens. First of all, I'm very open about most everything I've done, try and keep context appropriate, but I had the unfortunate experience of taking LSD and psilocybin when I was all too young, and those were bad experiences. Some of them were bad in the moment, some of them were bad after the moment. It is something I do not recommend, and I'm not saying that to be politically correct. I'm not saying that because it's true. The reality is that being a child, an adolescent, or a teenager is a psychedelic experience. And your brain is still wiring up in all sorts of interesting ways, and everything seems chaotic. And even if you're one of those rare kids that seems to have everything rode up appropriately, you don't want to throw massive amounts of neuromodulators in there haphazardly and start tampering with the wiring. That's my deep belief, okay? That's my deep belief. However, it does appear that at least for adults who are not suffering from particular psychiatric challenges, namely forms of psychosis, right? This is real. I mean, 1 in 100 people experiences schizophrenic symptoms, et cetera. It's a very high number if you think about it. Certain forms of bipolar depression, that the clinical trials on psychedelics, and here I'm assuming when you say hallucinogens, you're referring to psychedelics, are very, very compelling. The psychiatric community is now being forced to look at these data because the data are very compelling. What do we know about these data? And yes, I've participated in 2 such clinical trials, one on high-dose psilocybin, high dose meaning more than 2 grams, taken twice. By the way, this is with the support of medically trained therapists, and the use of psychedelics such as psilocybin, mostly psilocybin, not so much LSD. Do you know why most of the trials are on psilocybin and not LSD? I do, but I'm curious if, it's not to... What's that? LSD's too long. That's right. That people need to go home. People need to go home. The technicians need to, and LSD is a long ride. It's a long ride. So the thing about psilocybin is that the sort of journey, the trip is, somewhere on the order of anywhere from, 3 to 7 hours, which can fit into a reasonable workday for a technician, clinician, and LSD can be many, many hours longer. The kind of Mount Everest of psychedelics, which is under investigation by a colleague of mine at Stanford School of Medicine, Nolan Williams, is iboga, which is 22 hours long. It has cardiac effects. This is not something to get cavalier with. This is something only to be done in a clinical context with medical experts there. And iboga is very interesting. From what I'm told, I have not participated in an iboga trial. Iboga allows for or induces a state in which you do not hallucinate at all with eyes open, but the moment you go eyes closed, you get a high-resolution, accurate picture of prior events in your life, but you have agency, you have volition inside of those pictures, and you're able to change your behavior and re-sculpt your relationship to those experiences. Like, wow. And the state of Kentucky in California recently, the state of Kentucky in the United States, thank goodness Kentucky isn't inside of California, that would be civil war. The state of Kentucky recently took the $40 million settlement from the opioid thing, right? You've all heard about that, the opioid crisis, and applied that money to iboga trials. So this stuff is happening. This stuff is really happening now in the US. In any event, psilocybin, these 2 sessions, medically supported 2 sessions, has been shown to be pretty effective in the treatment of major depression. Not completely effective. Sometimes there's adverse outcomes, but far more effective than the other pharmaceutical treatments that it's been compared to. So that's interesting. And psilocybin is serotonin. If you look at the structure of psilocybin, it looks like serotonin. So what we're talking about is a massive dose of serotonin, and psilocybin appears to bind near selectively to a particular serotonin receptor, and the outcome seems to be enhanced or more broad connectivity between brain areas that normally are not communicating with one another. Probably not the growth of new connections, but let's say the unveiling of the ability for certain brain areas to communicate with one another, whereas they couldn't prior. Different ways of thinking about the same problems, which is logically sound if you think about ways to deal with depression. Depression is characterized by a number of things, of course, but one of the hallmark features of depression, in addition to sleep challenges, is a lack of positive anticipation of the future. And it does seem that these macrodose psilocybin trials are helpful for that. Turns out that the microdosing of psilocybin has not been shown to be terribly effective, which is not to say it isn't, but the trials don't support that, although there aren't many trials of that yet. So it appears, if you had to pick between micro and macro dosing, go macro. But be careful. Be careful, and setting is important. Safety is important, and certainly not for children. And as long as, or adolescents or teenagers, I really, again, want to reemphasize that. The other thing is, as long as we're talking about psychedelics and hallucinogens, we should probably just touch on MDMA for a moment. First of all, MDMA ecstasy has a number of challenges or potential problems that need to be highlighted. First of all, contaminants. We have a fentanyl crisis in the US, so contaminants, so purity is essential. Second of all, it is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. And the methamphetamine part often gets people thinking like, whoa. It seems, however, that the inclusion of the methylene dioxy component increases serotonin dramatically, and it is the increase in serotonin, perhaps, or at least it's now thought, in addition to the increase in dopamine caused by the methamphetamine component, combined, that provides some sort of neuroprotective effect. The early reports that MDMA ecstasy is neurotoxic, quote unquote, puts holes in your brain, was flawed and indeed that paper was retracted. The researchers did that study in earnest, but then later discovered that when they reached for the MDMA on the shelf, they actually grabbed the methamphetamine. But the news agencies didn't report that retraction. Now, our best evidence that MDMA, taken in the appropriate clinically supported context, can act as an empathogen, can help people develop empathy for themselves and help relieve trauma. And indeed, the clinical trials show that at the proper dosing and the proper frequency with the proper support, there's up to 60% and as high as 67% remission of PTSD. Remarkable. With support, okay? Not just taking Molly and like dancing in the desert. We're talking about in the eye mask, we're talking about going inward, we're talking about relaying your experience, we're talking about the challenging experience or experiences with someone who's qualified to help you deal with all of that, et cetera, and someone to drive you home because you feel like a puddle afterwards. Talking about all of that. We're not talking about eye gazing with your partner, telling them how much you love them. You're talking about empathy for self, love for self, which is a concept that frankly, I've often struggled with. I've thought, people would say, you gotta love yourself. I'm like, what is that? Like, what is that? I love my bulldog, I love my friends, I love cuttlefish, but like, what is that? And I think through the use of MDMA, there seems to be this ability to develop empathogenic states to yourself, but of course the reason for the clinical trials insisting that people stay in the eye mask and communicate their experience, maybe popping out of it every once in a while and talking with somebody in a trusted person in a way that can be helpful towards dealing with the trauma, is that the problem with having that much serotonin and that much dopamine in your system is that you can become empathic toward anything. So we've all known people that take MDMA, listen to a particular soundtrack, and they're like, I'm gonna become a musician. I love music. And again, I'm not recommending anyone do MDMA, but in recent years, I've really changed my stance on psychedelics. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I never would have had this discussion, certainly not with a microphone in front of my face, anything being recorded. Would have worried about losing my job at Stanford or elsewhere. But we now have many laboratories at Stanford and elsewhere that are doing work that is federally funded on these compounds. And if you think about these compounds, while they have been used recreationally, are simply ways to adjust levels of neuromodulators in the brain, serotonin, dopamine, et cetera. That's really all they are, although they do it very potently and therefore caution needs to be applied. And as long as we're on that topic, I should mention that ketamine, everyone's excited about ketamine. When I was growing up, I was taught that there's a compound that's really dangerous. It's called PCP, phencyclidine. They are the same compound They don't tell you this. Ketamine and PCP, same thing. And I learned about PCP as the compound that was going to make criminals like punch light poles and beat up 12 cops. And yeah, I watched too much Chips when I was growing up. For those of you old enough to remember, it was like Ponch and John. They were on the motorcycles with the shorts. My sister watched it too, but for completely different reasons. So PCP was like this demonized drug. But ketamine and all this stuff about ketamine is now legal in the US. I don't know its status here in Sydney, so I'll see if I get arrested on the way out. But, ketamine is potentially addictive. People talk about the K-hole, et cetera. Weird name, by the way. The whole business with ketamine is, again, it's a potent MDMA, N-methyl D-aspartate blocker, which blocks neuroplasticity in the short term, expands it in the long term. So the way to think about these compounds, these drugs, is by way of their mechanism. And so it should be no surprise that they're able to induce neuroplasticity, but the goal is not plasticity. This is very, very important. The goal is not plasticity. The goal is plasticity directed toward a particular positive outcome. Anytime you have plasticity, you have the potential for maladaptive plasticity as well. And so that's an additional cautionary note. As I often say on the podcast, I don't say that just to protect me, although I am a little bit worried now about what I just said over the last 5 minutes. I say that to protect you. Next question before I get myself in trouble. What about what? DMT. Yeah, dimethyltryptamine. Yeah, it leads to lower thresholds for impulsivity, like screaming out, "What about DMT?" Just kidding. I don't, sorry. So I'm just joking. You seem like you could take it, so yeah. So I've never done DMT, but I've heard it's a high-speed freight train into your consciousness, behind the circuit board and back again. So there are a few great studies on DMT and ayahuasca, just as long as we're expanding into the full trip down to the jungle. And the data are interesting. It's harder to know what's going on in these very short trip, massive neuromodulator release type drug scenarios. Robin Cartart-Harris at the University of California, San Francisco is somebody who's looking at DMT more extensively, and I don't want to avoid giving you an answer, but I do want to avoid giving you a wrong answer that's not informed. One thing I'll say, and this is just, rarely do I plug anything related to the podcast, but we are actually providing some support to Robin and others' laboratory for the study of things like DMT. One of the things that we do at the podcast, and this is not a request for anything, we do take a significant portion of the proceeds from our premium channel and we fund human studies of exciting things like DMT. We're supporting Robin's lab this coming year. I've pooled together some other donors to provide support for all human studies, no animal studies. And the goal is really to fill in important blanks like the study of DMT, as well as other things. We're currently funding the eating disorders laboratory at Columbia University. Eating disorders, by the way, anorexia nervosa in particular, the most deadly of all psychiatric disorders, really tragic challenge there. So I just mentioned that getting funding for science on really kind of next level stuff is hard for reasons that would take up the whole night. So that's one thing that I'm really trying to do in the next few years. And again, this is not a request, but to pool together donors and get them to give money to laboratories to do the kind of stuff that's going to feed back to the general public very quickly, because I think we're all getting a little tired of the mouse study, which are great, but in 10 years this might lead to a blank for Alzheimer's or blank for autism. I think we're all getting a little tired of that narrative, so we're trying to accelerate the process. Okay, thank you. And it's not a sole effort. It's just, I do happen to know a lot about the way that funding mechanisms can get a little bit clogged, and so just trying to clear some of those clogs. The brain and gut axis, is this a thing? It is most definitely a thing. So I think one of the more exciting areas is the so-called gut-brain axis. We all now hear about the gut microbiome. I must say, down here, y'all are really evolved in this dimension. The other day I noticed, probably from jet lag and travel, and I don't know, maybe I swam in some stuff that had too much chlorine or something. I was getting some little skin thing on my face. I was like, all right, I'll go get some triple antibiotic ointment like I do back home, clean it up, because I forgot mine. So I go to the pharmacy here, what you call the chemist. I go to the pharmacy, and the guy behind the counter says, well, first of all, you can't get triple antibiotic ointment here. You need a prescription. I'm like, all right, well, this is gonna get tricky. Now I gotta forge a prescription. And I'm just kidding, don't do that, don't do that. And he says, but have you considered whether or not maybe your skin microbiome is struggling because of the lack of sleep, the jet lag, and maybe you were exposed to some chlorine or something? I thought, that's a logical way to think about it. Because we just did an episode on oral health where I'm telling everybody, hey, avoid these high alcohol astringent mouthwashes that kill your oral microbiome, because all the dentists and periodontists are telling me, yeah, they'll make your breath fresh, but actually it's wrecking your gut microbiome and it's bad for. So I take the probiotic. You guys have amazing probiotics here, and in a day, boom, it's done. Now, I didn't do a controlled clinical trial. I don't know whether or not that was really what did it, but it's an interesting idea. We know, for instance, that we have a distinct microbiome niches, different bacteria that live in our nasal passages, on the surface of our eyes, on the surface of our skin, in the urethra, in essentially every orifice, mucous membrane, but everywhere in and around our body, and that these little microbiota are, provided they are supported, they do many things, but among them, the gut microbiome, which of course starts in the mouth, as the oral health episode describes, with a lot of protocols as well. The gut microbiome, when it's well supported, creates certain fatty acids that are the precursors or catalysts for the production of certain neurotransmitters in the brain. And it is now so clear that enhancing the diversity of flora, of microbiota in the gut and mouth is great for the nervous system. So much so that some of the studies on relief from certain neuropsychiatric conditions are being achieved through, and I know it's not pleasant, but microbiota transfer between individuals, so-called fecal transplants, which always makes me a little bit uncomfortable to think about. Never had one, but it's pretty interesting. Despite the discomfort of thinking about that process, at least for me, the whole business of taking the gut microbiota from one individual that's not suffering from something and putting it into another individual and seeing relief from certain symptoms of given conditions is really compelling. So I think that we should all be thinking about ways to support our gut-brain axis. It's very clear that the best low-cost, no-supplement way to do that is going to be to consume 1 to 4 servings of some fermented food. No, beer doesn't count. Low sugar fermented foods. I suppose beer does count, but it comes with some other issues, such as kimchi or sauerkrauts or kefirs, or every culture seems to have its own probiotic, prebiotic foods, and that's going to be the best way. And it's clear that it has immense benefit. And then when you don't have access to those foods, doing things like taking a pill probiotic now and again is probably not a bad idea if you're traveling or you're sleep deprived. The challenge with that sort of thing is that it's a generalized effect of supporting multiple systems in the brain and body. So it's going to be a long time, maybe never, before you see a really nice, clean study that says that, okay, increasing the amount of lactobacillus in the gut by taking, X number of milligrams of lactobacillus improves your cognition. You're not going to find that study. Why? Because in science, it's important, and in health, to distinguish between moderating effects and mediating effects. Lots of things can moderate a given feature of your brain or health. So for instance, if God forbid a fire alarm went off tonight, it would moderate our tension, modulate. Kentucky's in California, and now I'm saying modulate your attention, but it doesn't mediate attention. On a normal basis, the fire alarm isn't involved in your attention, whereas certain other things mediate those mechanisms of attention. So when you improve sleep, you're going to see positive effects on any number of things. When you sleep deprive people, you're going to see deficits in any number of things. These are not direct effects, these are indirect effects. Likewise with the microbiome. So I think gut microbiome sits in the various, what I call pillars of mental health, physical health, and performance. These are the things that we should try and tend to on a regular basis to give buoyancy to our mental health, physical health, and performance. But I wouldn't get too caught up in wondering which exact Microbiota are important. I think diversity of the microbiome is key. If you're taking antibiotics, you want to do something to counter that through pill probiotics, et cetera. And certainly antibiotics aren't bad, but the overuse of antibiotics certainly can be. And good on you for having chemists that know better than to just hand me a bottle of triple antibiotic ointment. Quality of sleep, going to bed early compared to sleeping late but still for 8 hours. Depends on whether or not your chronotype, which for a long time I did not think was real, but based on newer data, it's absolutely clear are real, whether or not you feel best going to bed early, waking up early, or going to bed at a more typical time of 10 p.m. to say wake up, or 11 p.m. and waking up at 7 a.m. I see that, for any folks leaving, they're like early to bed, right? I get it. I'm not offended. It's fine. I get it. It would not be the first time that people, I always say, if nothing else, the podcast will cure insomnia because the episodes are very, very long. For some people, they just feel spectacularly better going to sleep early and waking up early. Spectacularly better. I'm one such person. Other people feel much better staying up late, waking up late. The total duration of sleep is important. The regularity of sleep, it turns out, is becoming a very important variable, or it has always been an important variable, but the data are pointing to the fact that if you are somebody who feels best going to sleep